It was the year 222 CE, and the streets of Rome trembled with the footfalls of soldiers rather than the merchants and matrons who usually colored the forum with their ceaseless routines. Somewhere near the Palatine Hill, amid the groves of laurel and the clatter of bronze, a crowd had gathered not to hail a triumph or witness a procession, but to watch a former emperor's memory be flushed down the Tiber like wastewater. The praetorians had completed their task. His blood still stained the marbled floors of the imperial palace. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, though no one had called him that with a straight face in years. History remembers him more vividly by the title whispered in disbelief, Elagabalus. Once a boy god plucked from the highlands of Syria, Elagabalus had been paraded into Rome on a chariot as if he were a new Apollo, crowned with eastern silks and oiled in frankincense. 4 years later, he was being torn limb from limb. His corpse defiled, dragged through the city like a criminal or a joke that had gone too far. He had ruled not with an iron fist, but with painted nails and divine conviction, unnerving the Senate with every marriage ritual and smile. Rome, ever adaptable to foreign gods and foreign blood, found itself uncharacteristically squeamish. Born in Emesa, a city nestled in the hills of Roman Syria, the boy who would become emperor had been raised not for politics, but for priesthood. His family, the Severan dynasty, had ruled Rome with a mixture of military cunning and dynastic scheming. After the assassination of Caracalla and the brief interlude of Macrinus, Elagabalus's grandmother, Julia Maesa, made a calculated move. She announced to the legions in Syria that her grandson was not just kin to the former emperor, but the legitimate heir, a living vessel of the eastern sun god, Elagabal, a divine child worthy of both crown and altar. The soldiers, perhaps more dazzled by Maesa's bribes than her theology, rallied. A 14-year-old boy was declared emperor, his name officially Romanized, his eyebrows carefully painted, and his voice barely deepened. Rome now belonged to a godchild who had never seen its walls. But Rome had long tolerated the exotic Mithras Isis. Even Christ had crept through its alleys, and so the city held its breath. They expected a puppet, a pretty boy with a foreign accent to be maneuvered by his grandmother and mother, whose ambition stretched further than any imperial avenue. But Elagabalus, draped in his priestly vestments, had different aspirations. He did not seek merely to rule Rome. He wanted to convert it. From his first arrival, he behaved less like Caesar and more like a missionary. The sacred stone of Elagabal, a conical black meteorite hauled across the sea, was placed in a specially built temple on the Palatine. The emperor insisted that his god was not merely a god, but the god above Jupiter, above Mars. He married the stone in a public ceremony, dressed in golden robes, his eyelids tinted with kohl. For Rome, who had welcomed dozens of deities into her city, this was not shocking in itself. What made it dangerous was the presumption that the gods of Rome were subordinate and that their hierarchy could be rearranged like coins in a foreign purse. He restructured festivals, insisted on rituals that puzzled even the most syncretic priests, and walked into the Senate as if it were an annex to his temple. Senators, stoic and weary, muttered about Eastern degeneracy. The urban mob, less invested in cosmology and more inbred, tolerated the spectacle with the kind of bemusement usually reserved for provincial parades. But somewhere under the incense, a rot was setting, in the sense that the empire itself was being made into a shrine for one boy's god, and perhaps one boy's vanity. The empire had expected docility, a quiet figurehead with divine lineage propped up by older, more experienced hands. But Elagabalus was not content to be seen and not heard. At 14, he may have lacked the subtlety of a seasoned politician, but he possessed the uncompromising fervor of a zealot and the theatrical instincts of a born performer. In the temples of Syria, he had led ceremonies as high priest of Elagabal, dancing and chanting beneath the blazing sun, clothed in gold and crimson. That flare did not dim with elevation, it intensified. From the very beginning, he treated the Roman gods as provincial curiosities. Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, long the spiritual apex of Rome's pantheon, was politely sidelined. The sun god Elagabal, his personal deity, his ancestor by ritual if not by blood, was lifted above all his cult, transplanted wholesale into the city. A grand new temple, the Elagabalus, was constructed on the Palatine Hill, an architectural affront to Roman religious order. It glistened with Syrian ornamentation and housed the sacred black stone, a meteorite veiled in silk, kissed by the emperor each morning with reverent devotion. To the senators, the gesture was galling. Religion had always been political, yes, but predictably so a shared scaffolding of rites and traditions that underpinned Roman identity. Elagabalus disrupted that balance. He imported rituals that required exotic animals, strange music, and processions that felt more like bacchanals than sacrifices. In one festival, he paraded the sacred stone through the streets on a chariot drawn by white horses walking backward before it in priestly robes, scattering gold dust into the air. The spectacle was bewildering even to a public well-versed in divine theatrics. And then there were the marriages, not just his own, though those would soon become notorious, but ritual unions between his god and the goddesses of Rome. One year, he arranged a symbolic marriage between Elagabalus and Urania, a Phoenician goddess of the heavens. Another time it was Minerva, or perhaps Juno. The records disagree, possibly because the ceremony changed depending on the mood of the divine groom. In each case, Elagabalus officiated with priestly solemnity, as if these symbolic couplings could seduce the Roman pantheon into accepting their new solar overlord. The real marriages, too, sent ripples through Roman society. Elagabalus wed at least 5 times women of noble lineage priestesses, even a Vestal Virgin, a sacrilege punishable by death under Roman law. Yet here it was done not in secret but in broad daylight, accompanied by music and incense. The emperor claimed it was the will of Elagabalus, and as Pontifex Maximus he had the divine authority to overrule tradition. The Senate grumbled, the priests demurred, but the imperial guard still protected him, and so the rituals continued. For all his scandal, Elagabalus remained maddeningly consistent. He did not abandon one belief to adopt another more palatable. He demanded the empire bend to accommodate his vision. He was not trying to offend, he was trying to transform. In his mind, Rome was not the center of the world, but merely the newest limb of a broader, sun-drenched cosmic order. If that meant reshaping its rituals, rewriting its calendars, and dragging ancient relics into a new temple, so be it. To him, such acts were not desecration, they were elevation. But not everyone shared his view. Even his own family, the ambitious Julia Maesa and her daughter Julia Soaemias, began to question whether the boy emperor could maintain the delicate balancing act between spectacle and statecraft. The crowds, once curious, grew restless. The Senate, always slow to act, began murmuring about omens. Rome had survived madmen before. It could survive another. But Elagabalus was not mad in the way of Nero or Caligula. He was deliberate, and that perhaps was more dangerous. The Elagabalus was no mere temple. It was a statement, a gleaming assertion that the spiritual architecture of the Roman world could be revised like outdated law. The emperor's personal god Elagabalus was not to be honored as one among many. He was to reign alone. The other deities, those austere, begrudging Roman constructs of discipline and ancestry, were treated more like guests at a banquet than sovereigns in their own right. And when the emperor began ordering the most sacred relics of Roman religion to be moved into his temple, the line between audacity and sacrilege began to blur. The fire of Vesta, the eternal flame tended by virgin priestesses since the earliest days of the Republic, was quietly extinguished and relocated. Sacred shields of Mars, the Ancilia, which were said to guarantee Rome's invincibility, were removed from their ancient resting place and hung like trophies on the walls of the sun god's new sanctuary. Statues of Astarte Urania. Even Bacchus were placed inside not as honored figures, but as companions, concubines perhaps to Elagabalus, who now stood above them all in the form of his black meteorite gleaming under torchlight. To Romans who had long prided themselves on religious inclusivity, this was something altogether different. Syncretism was one thing, submission was another. It was not the foreignness of Elagabalus that rankled. Rome had imported gods before. It was the hierarchy, the rearranging of celestial furniture, the implication that Jupiter himself must bow. And Elagabalus did not hide his intentions. On the contrary, he delighted in them. During festivals he wore priestly vestments of purple and gold, his face painted, his arms bare, his movements choreographed in the manner of Syrian rituals. He would dance in the sanctuary, chanting praises to the sun, while senators stood stiff-backed and mute, their togas wrapped tightly around their discomfort. Every gesture reinforced the message the emperor did not serve Rome. Rome now served him, or more precisely, served his god. Even his meals became extensions of this cosmic theater. He dined only at certain hours, depending on astrological signs, and filled his banquets with symbols of divine favor, golden dishes, rare birds, and foods shaped into sunbursts and stars. To guests, it was both mesmerizing and unsettling, a dinner party conducted like an initiation rite. As the imperial court became increasingly ceremonial, the old rhythms of Roman governance began to break down. Council meetings were delayed by omens. Legal decisions were postponed for festivals. More than once, the emperor failed to appear at civic rituals, entirely choosing instead to perform elaborate devotions within his private sanctuary. He did not merely blur the line between priest and emperor, he dissolved it. Still, many dared not voice their unease openly. The Praetorian Guard remained loyal, or at least obedient. And Julia Mesa continued to distribute patronage carefully. But behind closed doors, patience was fraying. The elite resented their marginalization, and the people, never overly devout, were confused by the growing abstraction of imperial ceremonies. This wasn't the kind of divine rule they had come to expect. It was not Augustus veiling himself in piety, nor Hadrian consulting philosophers. It was something less familiar, less Roman, and therefore more dangerous. Even the architecture began to reflect this rupture. Statues of Jupiter and Mars were quietly removed from public spaces, replaced by symbols of the sun, golden discs, burning wheels, rays of light carved into stone. The coins of the realm bore not the laureled profile of the emperor, but images of the sacred stone flanked by stars. Rome was not being ruled from its senate or its forum, but from a shrine built on a hill where the emperor kissed a meteorite and whispered in a foreign tongue. By now, it was no longer clear whether Elagabalus saw himself as emperor first or priest first. Perhaps he didn't distinguish the two at all. Perhaps he believed quite literally that the god within the stone had chosen him not just to worship, but to rule. And if that meant dragging the old gods out of their temples and seating them beside his own deity like courtiers, so be it. But empires do not surrender their myths easily. And while Rome could accommodate many faiths, it was far less tolerant of exclusivity, especially from a teenager in robes. It was not just religion that Elagabalus sought to reorder. The emperor had a fondness for ceremony in all things, including the most intimate rituals of identity and desire. The palace became a theater of contrasts, a place where sacred relics hung beside silks and where imperial decrees were issued in between cosmetics applications. The emperor's face, always carefully painted, became a mask not of deceit, but of declaration. He was, in the most literal sense, crafting a new imperial image, one scented with myrrh, shaded in kohl, and utterly unrecognizable to his predecessors. His marriages, already the subject of senatorial complaint, began to take on a more performative nature. He divorced and remarried with the frequency of a man sampling wines. Among his most infamous wives was Aquilia Severa, a Vestal Virgin consecrated to eternal chastity and symbolic of Rome's moral order. By marrying her, Elagabalus committed an act of religious transgression that bordered on state blasphemy. But he defended the union with characteristic irony, claiming it was a divine match that would produce godlike offspring. There were no children, only scandal. Then came the men. Roman emperors had never been paragons of heterosexual restraint, but Elagabalus distinguished himself by treating same-sex unions not as indulgence, but as ceremony. He took lovers from all corners of the empire, athletes, dancers, charioteers, but reserved special favor for one man in particular, a former slave and charioteer named Heracles. Elagabalus referred to him openly as his husband, and was frequently seen in public acting as the submissive partner, kissing his feet, calling him lord. Senators watched in horrified silence as the emperor, dressed in veils and makeup, paraded through the palace on Heracles' arm. He was not content to merely cross the lines of propriety, he wanted to redraw them. The imperial court swelled with eunuchs, actors, and mystics. He surrounded himself with people who defied Rome's rigid expectations of gender and role. At night, he would host dinners where men dressed as brides and women as generals. There was no satire in this, no sly political commentary, only a sincere theatrical kind of reimagination. And if whispers are to be believed, Elagabalus sought to make these transformations permanent. Ancient historians, whose scorn often drips through their ink, recount with a mixture of horror and fascination that the emperor offered vast sums of gold to any physician who could perform a surgery to give him female genitalia. Whether this is true or colored by exaggeration, it reveals how utterly the emperor baffled Roman understanding of identity. He did not merely perform femininity, he may have sought to embody it. These acts, while scandalous, were not without precedent in the empire's peripheries. Gender variance was not unheard of in Syrian religious cults, where eunuch priests served under the banner of goddesses and cosmic dualities. Elagabalus, steeped in that world from childhood, may have seen his behavior not as rebellion, but as sacred expression. To Roman eyes, however, it was grotesque inversion, an emperor who dared not only to abandon tradition, but to blur its lines entirely. Even administrative appointments became subject to whim and theater. Government posts, it was said, were sometimes awarded based on the beauty of a man's hair or the shape of his legs. Courtiers were chosen not for loyalty, but for novelty. There were reports, likely apocryphal, though too detailed to dismiss, of contests held to determine who among Rome's men was best endowed, with winners receiving civic honors. Whether or not these tales are true, they were believed. And belief in imperial politics often proves more fatal than fact. What Elagabalus may have seen as playful subversion or divine authenticity, Rome interpreted as instability. His reign was not merely eccentric, it was threatening. Gender, after all, was no private matter in ancient Rome. It was a civic identity tightly bound to legal rights, military service, and public dignity. To disturb those categories was to challenge the structure of society itself. And yet, amid the pearls and veils and performances, there was also something undeniably Roman in his excess. Elagabalus, like Nero before him, wielded spectacle as governance. But where Nero played the tragic hero, Elagabalus danced as the divine bride, joyful, unapologetic, and utterly alien to the marble halls that tried in vain to contain him. The empire that had once crowned him now watched him with unease, and within the imperial household itself, cracks began to show. Elagabalus, though emperor, had always been outnumbered in his own family. The Severan dynasty was a matriarchy in all but name, and no one understood this better than Julia Maesa, grandmother architect of his rise, and the last serious political mind in a palace increasingly full of mystics and mimes. She had gambled everything to install her grandson on the throne, leveraging bloodlines, forged ancestry, and gold to convince the Syrian legions that Elagabalus was the son of Caracalla. The lie had worked. The boy had been crowned. But now, with each festival, each gender-defying proclamation, each public humiliation of Rome's ancient rites, Maesa began to see her creation slipping from her grasp, not only politically, but culturally. Elagabalus was not governing an empire. He was performing a mystery play in which everyone else had been cast without consent. At first, she tried to guide him. She whispered warnings, encouraged him to name a co-ruler to adopt more Roman behaviors in public. Elagabalus, eager to please but fundamentally unchanged, agreed to adopt his cousin Maesa's other grandson, a boy named Severus Alexander. 15 years old, mild in speech and manner, Alexander was everything Elagabalus was not. Quiet, obedient, and Roman in the most digestible sense. For a time, the adoption soothed tensions. The Senate breathed a little easier. The praetorians, always more attached to stability than ideology, began to hedge their loyalties. But Elagabalus, sensing the shift, grew paranoid. He dismissed Alexander from court, tried to revoke the adoption, and then, in a decision that would prove his undoing, attempted to have his cousin executed. Julia Maesa, watching carefully, made her move. She had always known how to read the room, and the mood of the Praetorian Guard was souring. Promises were made. Coins were minted with Alexander's face. And when the emperor's guards refused to carry out the execution order, the palace dynamic inverted. Elagabalus, emperor of Rome and high priest of the sun, found himself outnumbered in his own corridors. On a cold March morning in 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard struck. The emperor, still only 18, was seized along with his mother Julia Soaemias. The details, recorded with theatrical relish by later historians, suggest a spectacle of betrayal, soldiers rushing through the palace, imperial curtains torn aside, screams echoing through perfumed halls. There was no trial. There was no plea. Elagabalus and his mother were dragged from the palace and butchered on the spot. But even in death, Elagabalus defied Roman decorum. His body, stripped naked, was paraded through the streets not as a man, not as an emperor, but as a cautionary tale. His corpse was mutilated, then thrown into the public latrines and finally into the Tiber, the same river that had swallowed so many of Rome's secrets. His mother received no better. For those who had once hailed him as divine, there was no mourning. The sun god, it seemed, had set. Julia Maesa remarkably retained her position. Her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, was installed as emperor, a safe vanilla option for a senate that had seen enough theater for one generation. The Elagabalium was quietly renamed. The black stone was sent back to Syria. Temples were reconsecrated, coins melted down, edicts rescinded. Elagabalus was condemned in the Damnatio Memoriae, a ritual erasure in which names were scratched off monuments, images chiseled into blankness. But erasure in Rome was always aspirational. It rarely succeeded. His memory lingered not as a failed administrator or foreign usurper, but as a symbol of transgression of blurred boundaries and dangerous performances. What frightened Rome was not simply what Elagabalus did, but the fact that he had done it all with such conviction that he had looked into the face of tradition and smiled. There was no tomb for Elagabalus, no sarcophagus, no statuary memorial on the Appian Way. His name was not carved into triumphal arches or etched beneath busts in marble halls. His body, unburied, had fed the river fish. And yet, like many whose stories Rome tried hardest to silence, he endured not as a monument, but as a whisper. In the years following his death, the city quickly reasserted its boundaries. The temples returned to their familiar rhythms. The rites of Jupiter resumed atop the Capitoline. The Vestal Virgins once again tended their fire without interruption. Coins bearing the sun god's black stone were melted down, their gold repurposed for more modest, more Roman purposes. The official histories reclassified Elagabalus as a deviant, a curiosity, part Eastern mystic, part child tyrant, wholly unsuitable to Rome's dignity. But there was something in that discomfort that proved unusually durable. Later writers, some scandalized, others amused, returned to his story again and again. They found in him a kind of imperial phantom, a contradiction in silk, both emperor and outsider, priest and provocateur, boy and enigma. He was described as effeminate, extravagant, grotesque, yet rarely stupid. His decisions, while erratic, were not aimless. They suggested a logic of their own, one steeped not in Roman civics, but in Syrian cosmology and ritual inversion. It is tempting to view him through modern eyes, to label him with contemporary categories, to interpret his identity as deliberate rebellion or proto-politics. But Elagabalus did not live in a world that distinguished selfhood in such terms. In his time, gender, power, and divinity were not isolated facets. They were overlapping performances, each one bleeding into the next. If he blurred the lines, it was not necessarily to shock, but because he understood no reason not to. To Rome, that was the true transgression. Not the marriages, not the cosmetics, not the god in a chariot, but the refusal to compartmentalize. Elagabalus did not just ignore the masks of empire. He wore all of them at once. And yet, even in the moralizing works of historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian, men eager to paint him as an embarrassment, there are glimmers of fascination. They linger over his rituals, his costumes, his proclamations. They quote his jokes, describe his banquets in detail. One senses a reluctant awe. He may have been condemned, but he was never quite forgotten. Centuries later, his story would be revived in quiet corners, in whispers among poets, in allusions by playwrights, and in the unspoken spaces between Roman lines. Artists imagined him in pearls and robes reclining beneath the desert sun. Scholars debated the accuracy of the surgical rumors, the sincerity of his religion. His brief reign became a canvas onto which later generations projected their own fears, their own curiosities about the self, about rule, about the boundaries of the permissible. Perhaps that is why Elagabalus remains so oddly present. Not because he ruled well, he didn't. Not because he led armies or wrote laws, he didn't. But because for 4 unsettling years, the most powerful man in the world believed he could be something other than what Rome had prescribed. He believed the empire could be restructured not through conquest, but through ritual, costume, and devotion. That belief, naive, perhaps sacred, shook the foundations of a world built on order. Today, the ruins of his temple are barely visible. The sacred stone is long gone. No prayer is offered in his name. But in the records that try to erase him, his silhouette persists, veiled in gold face, painted dancing backward before a god no one else believed in. A boy who ruled like a priest, who reigned like a bride, who died like a warning. What does it mean, after all, to hold power in a world that cannot recognize you? Elagabalus may have worn the purple robe, but he never truly wore the Roman script that came with it. His reign was less a political episode than a ritual inversion, 4 years of twilight in which the empire looked at itself through a smoky mirror. Gender, divinity, hierarchy all became unstable under his rule, not because he intended to destroy them, but because he reimagined them as fluid, performative, and deeply sacred. For an empire obsessed with lineage and law, this was a provocation. Yet Rome had long accepted divine rulers. Emperors became gods after death. Statues breathed with sacred breath, the Vestals channeled the will of fire. Elagabalus simply collapsed the distance between mortal and divine too quickly, too earnestly, and with too much fragrance. He did not flirt with godhood. He declared it. What unnerved his contemporaries, perhaps more than his rights or partners, was the sincere insistence that performance could be power. Not the kind won in battle or secured through legal fiat, but the ancient kind, the kind sung by oracles and painted on temple walls where masks and truth were not opposites, but twins. His body in the end was cast aside like an unwanted offering. But the spectacle of his life, part priestly ecstasy, part imperial rebellion, was harder to bury. In the centuries that followed, Rome saw greater tyrants, more destructive fools, emperors whose wars fractured provinces and bled treasuries dry. Yet few left so delicate and enduring a discomfort. Because Elagabalus, for all his eccentricities, did not break Rome, he exposed it. He exposed the fragility of its categories, the rigidity of its myths, the theater behind its gravitas. In the soft fabric of his gowns and the glittering dust of his rituals, he offered a vision of rulership that was both older and stranger than Rome could tolerate, a return to the divine monarchs of the East, where kings danced, wept, and bled in imitation of gods. And so, when the Praetorian Guard dragged his body through the streets, when the Senate scratched his name from stone, when historians penned their acid-laced lines, they were not merely condemning an emperor. They were burying a possibility. Yet it is difficult to unsee what has once been shown. Elagabalus left no monuments, but he left a question whispered through the centuries, echoing faintly from the ruins of a hilltop shrine. What if the emperor is a bride? What if the ritual is the rule? These were not questions Rome wanted to answer. And yet, beneath the marble and ash, beneath the carefully restored altars and renounced names, the memory remains a veiled figure dancing in gold, offering Rome not destruction, but a mirror strange, polished, and uncomfortably honest.